Good afternoon. Today is January 26th. Good afternoon, committee, and welcome to the Ways and Means Committee and our fiscal briefing today. We have the David Romans here with us and Teresa Tzinski. One gold star for me today for our fiscal briefing. We here in the state of Maryland are fortunate that we are in a strong financial position. However, with a possible recession in the near future, we cannot count on our good fortune to continue. We will decide this session how much we need to save, how much we need to spend, and how much we need to use for tax relief. We will keep in mind the long-term fiscal health of the state when making these decisions. The Department of Legislative Services will brief us on the governor's proposed budget, the long-term budget outlook, and major fiscal issues. I look forward to an informative briefing and to hearing questions from the committee, and with that, I will turn it over. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think we're going to put the document on the screen so you can see it. There's a very long fiscal briefing. You may have seen we presented it to Appropriations and Budget and Tax yesterday. I am not going to go through that whole document. We're going to talk about the first 8 pages, which give you a high-level overview. Teresa's going to talk a little bit about the economy and revenues, as that's her expertise. Then we'll be happy to answer whatever questions the members have. If we can get the item up on the screen, give a sec. There we go. Great. So on the first page, it just shows you the budget growth. Overall, this budget actually declines by about $1.1 billion or 2%. The biggest reason for that, and you can sort of see it in the chart, is the federal funds are down. There was an extraordinary amount of one-time federal stimulus money that came through the economy, and a lot of it was spent in fiscal 22 and in fiscal 23, and it's starting to dissipate in fiscal 24. There's still some money remaining. Two big pieces are since the pandemic began, really, we've gotten an enhanced Medicaid match. So instead of the federal government paying 50% of our Medicaid costs, they're paying 56%. And that is phasing out during calendar 24. So the costs shift back from federal funds to general funds. Similarly, there were a number of enhancements to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program at the federal level as sort of temporary help to people impacted by the pandemic. And those are disappearing in fiscal 24, so we don't get the federal funding for those. General funds are down a little bit. It's a little deceptive because in fiscal 23, we put about $2 billion into our rainy day fund. So we appropriated a lot of money, but it went into a savings account. We're not appropriating any additional money in 24. When you take out that money that goes into a savings account, the budget actually grows a couple of percent from fiscal 23 to 24. So the governor is leaving a fund balance at the end of fiscal 24 of $820 million. This is an extraordinarily high general fund balance. In normal times, you usually see more in the 100 to 200 million range, but the administration is concerned about the potential for a recession, so they wanted to reserve some additional money to deal with the impact of a recession if one hits. In addition, they've left $2.5 billion in the rainy day fund. That's equivalent to 10% of the state's general fund revenues. 10% is what our department has recommended for a number of years now is about the right amount to have in the rainy day fund to help offset the impact of a kind of mild recession over the first couple of years. So it seems to be about the right amount of funding. So all told, there's $3.3 billion of cash reserves between the rainy day fund and general fund that the administration is sort of saving. The only other thing I note on this first page is just that there's additional federal money from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that passed a year ago, and then the Inflation Reduction Act that passed a few months back. Both of these bills will send a substantial amount of additional money to the states, but most of it is competitive, and that competitive process is just beginning, so we don't know how much money Maryland will receive. But there's potential for a couple of $1 billion to come into the state through those competitive grants, and that is not reflected in the budget because obviously they don't know what they might receive. All right, let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So I call your attention to the chart here. And what the chart does is it highlights there's a number of items in the governor's budget that are contingent on legislation. So you can see there's 3 significant provisions related to targeted tax relief. The most significant is to extend the earned income tax credit enhancements that were enacted by the General Assembly in 2021 as sort of a temporary assistance to people impacted by the pandemic. The governor is proposing to extend those at a cost of about $151 million. They essentially increased the refundable amount of the tax credit, both for families and for individuals, for a couple of years. The other thing that's included in that provision is, and it was done in 2021, was the state extended coverage to people who lacked a social security number. The governor is proposing to continue that practice as well. All that's rolled into that $151 million cost. Second item is military retirement. The administration is proposing to exempt more military retirement income from taxation than the state currently does. Presently, for people 55 and up to $15,000 of military retirement income is exempt from the income tax. For people under 55, up to $5,000. We have not seen the governor's bill, so I don't know the exact adjustments that he's making, but it looks, based on the estimate of $33 million, that they're going to exempt most, if not all, of military retirement income going forward. And the third tax item is the child tax credit. The state has a child tax credit. It is targeted only to disabled children and only to families with adjusted gross income of $6,000 or less, so it doesn't reach very many people. The administration is proposing to expand it. Again, we have not seen the details, so I can't tell you exactly how broadly they're expanding it. But their estimate is it's going to cost $20 million. But without knowing what it's going to do, we can't tell you if that's a good number or not. So then the next group of things on that chart are spending contingent on the enactment of legislation. This is additional spending. That first group was kind of revenue losses. The biggest item here is the governor is proposing to accelerate the $15 minimum wage to October of this calendar year. It was supposed to go into effect in January of 2025. And there's a cost associated with that to the state budget of $218 million, because when the General Assembly passed that minimum wage phase up to $15 an hour, it also included rate increases for most healthcare providers, developmental disability providers, behavioral health providers, anyone who serves people through the state government, through the Medicaid program. And it was supposed to be rate increases of 4% in fiscal 25 and another 4% in fiscal 26 to help those folks keep up with wages going up. And the governor is proposing to accelerate all of those rate increases into fiscal 24. So in addition to the normal 4% most of those providers will get in the fiscal 24 budget, they would get an extra 8% in fiscal 24, so a 12% rate increase. But that's going from the 4 to 12% is contingent on your passing the minimum wage bill as the governor has proposed it. The other big item under the spending is there's a hospital assessment that the state has assessed for, 15 years or so. It generates almost $400 million a year, all of which goes to a special fund to support the Medicaid program. The administration is proposing for 1 year only to reduce that assessment by $50 million, and then they backfill the lost special fund revenue from that assessment with general funds so that the Medicaid program has adequate funding to pay all its bills. And then the last one I'll mention in that grouping is there's a Maryland Educator Shortage Act. Haven't seen the bill, but we're told it's a teacher recruitment program, and there's an estimated cost of $15 million. So those are sort of the major items tied to legislation. Now, so if we can turn to the next slide. So I think the biggest takeaway in this whole document is this chart on the state's structural budget outlook. So what do I mean by structural budget outlook? We're comparing ongoing revenues to ongoing spending. So we ignore fund balances and things that are used as sort of one-time revenues and one-time spending as well. And the blue bars show you the administration's forecast in the governor's budget books, and they show us with a structural surplus each year. But what they note elsewhere in the budget books is that the Blueprint Fund, which is the primary special fund that helps support the Kerwin education reforms, is projected to have an enormous deficit in fiscal 27 and 28. And if the Blueprint Fund doesn't have enough money to pay for that, those costs would fall on the general fund. So the red line layers those costs into the general fund forecast, and what you can see is by fiscal 27, the state would be facing about $1 billion structural budget shortfall, and by fiscal 28, well above $1 billion. So this is a significant challenge for the state in terms of thinking about spending and revenues going forward. And obviously, if a recession were to hit, which the revenue estimates do not assume a recession, but if one were to hit, this situation would look even worse. And so let's go to the next slide. So for those of you who were around last session or on the Spending Affordability Committee, back in December, Legislative Services presented a pretty rosy fiscal outlook through fiscal 28. And obviously, it's not as rosy anymore. And the primary reason it's different is sort of explained in this chart. Compensatory education costs, which is part of the K through 12 education formulas, are driven by the enrollment of students in free and reduced price meals. And that graphic shows you that this fall 2002, this past fall, the number of students qualifying for free and reduced price meals jumped by 110,000, which was quite unexpected and significantly increases the compensatory education funding. That formula goes up by nearly $400 million in the 24 budget. And that is a big cause of the stress in the Blueprint Fund, which spills over to the general fund. The reason there are so many more students qualifying for free and reduced price meals is for the first time ever, and as required by the Kerwin legislation, the state compared its Medicaid enrollment numbers for kids to the school enrollment, and it matched kids. And they found a number of students who were eligible for free and reduced price meals but had not filled out the paperwork that the schools collect and so forth. So that's why there's such a dramatic jump in the number of students. It is pretty much a statewide phenomenon. Almost every county had at least a 20% jump in their number of students qualifying for free and reduced price meals. Some counties were well over 50% jump. Overall, 51% of all students in public schools in Maryland are now eligible for free and reduced price meals as a result of this jump. The one thing to note is there were 3 jurisdictions that did not benefit from this. And the most notable is Baltimore City, which saw no jump in their free and reduced price meal counts. And the others were 2 of the counties, Wacomico County, and I think it was Dorchester County on the Eastern Shore. The reason they didn't jump is that they all had a very high percentage of their students already free and reduced price meals. For example, in Baltimore City, they already had 85% of the students qualified as free and reduced, so there wasn't much room for them to add additional kids. So that's a big driver of the budget. The next slide shows back in December, it was forecasted that the state would have about a $3.6 billion surplus for fiscal 24. And what we're trying to show here is, well, what changed? What did the governor do with that money? Now, obviously, as I mentioned, he left $820 million of it in the general fund balance to help mitigate a recession if one were to hit. Most of the rest, about a little over $2 billion, went to enhancements and initiatives. The 2 biggest items are the governor's proposing to put $500 million into a reserve account to pay for transportation capital in future years. He does not specify what transportation capital project that would be, just setting money aside for transportation capital needs. And then $500 million is deposited into the Blueprint Fund and was accounted for in our estimates of the shortfall there. But he tried to shore up the Blueprint Fund a little bit. So those are the 2 big initiatives. Then there's the minimum wage increase is the next largest item there. The tax relief that I talked about is quite a bit, about $133 million more than was anticipated in higher education. One of the benefits of that is that all of the public 4-year schools are capping tuition growth for in-state students at 2% for this year. A couple of other things to note here. There's about $78 million in behavioral health for what they're calling infrastructure investments. They are not specified beyond that, and the idea is that the new health secretary and her team would have the opportunity to identify what the best uses of those funds are to improve our behavioral health care system. There's also notably a hold harmless for K through 12 schools. There were 2 school systems that would actually have seen a net decrease in their school aid this year. The 2 are Baltimore City, which gets $32 million through the hold harmless so that their total education aid doesn't drop. The other is Allegheny County, which receives $5 million. Allegheny is sort of amusing in that the reason that they qualify is their wealth went way up. And their wealth went way up because somebody won like the Mega Millions or the Powerball. So they had a one-time enormous jump in their income. It'll go away in a year. But that's kind of what drove their issue. So those are kind of the highlights of the major initiatives. The administration also is just spending more on some programs like Medicaid and behavioral health because they think the costs will be higher than what was forecast in December. And for the Appropriations Committee, we will be closely analyzing that to see if we agree with those estimates. We can turn to the next slide. So this just has a series of bullets on sort of other enhancements in the budget. I think I've hit on most of these. I just mentioned a couple of others. Community college aid grows by about 11% or $40 million through the community college formulas. Community college formulas are tied to the aid per student at the public 4 years. So since there was a big investment there, it helps drive up the community college formula aid. And then for state employees, the governor's included a 2% cost of living increase effective July 1, and employee increments, which are sort of similar to merit increases that most employees will receive. Those tend to be worth between 2 and 4%, depending on where you are on the pay scale. So there's money for salary increases. That's cost almost $400 million. In addition, Governor Hogan back in November increased state employee salaries by 4.5%, but there was no money in the budget to do that. So Governor Moore is funding the fiscal 23 side of that cost, as well as the fiscal 24 ongoing impact of that. And combined over the 2 years, that's over a $600 million cost. So there is, over the last 18 months or so, state employees have seen a significant increase. The capital budget, there's about $1.2 billion of general obligation bonds, which is consistent with what the Spending Affordability Committee suggested should be funded. And there's over $1 billion of cash being used for capital projects as well. So it'll be a big year for the capital budget. So those are most of the highlights there. Oh, I should also mention just that the governor left in his budget $150 million unspecified for legislative initiatives, with the idea that $50 million of it would be operating, $100 million capital. So the General Assembly will be able to make some decisions about how to spend that $150 million, however you choose. The final part of my part of the presentation here is on the potential legislative issues. Kind of the major issues we think, for at least for the budget committees this year, one is that long-term sustainability, thinking about what to do about that structural budget problem in the out years. Consideration of the governor's legislative package, which certainly this committee will also be involved with. And then a couple of things. One is looking at the Medicaid program and the sufficiency of funding there. The state hiring and retention, as most of you probably know, about 13% of all state positions are currently vacant, and we've sort of been in this position for the last couple of years. So obviously the Committee Appropriations had a big hearing yesterday about what can be done to try to address that. I mean, I think part of the Moore administration's response appears to be, one, to hope that the 4.5% from November plus the additional increases in July help improve our hiring. And they're also going to spend some money on a sort of larger study to better understand how competitive our salaries are with other governments and with the private sector. So those are sort of the major issues. The other one I would mention is just this is the first year that the General Assembly has been able to reallocate money in the budget on its own without the governor having to sign off on it. So that'll be a new experience for you all. So that's sort of the high level on the budget. Teresa's going to talk for a minute about the economy and revenues.
Thank you. We have just a couple slides here on the economy and then the general fund revenues. And we're going to start with the economy. And the chart you see is just a snapshot of what happened in the Maryland economy during calendar 2022. And we're going to start with the labor market. The first couple of columns on this chart all deal with the labor market. And the first column is simply the year-over-year percent change for each month in 2022. So for example, in January, that's 3%. That means that employment in Maryland grew 3% in January of 2022 versus January of 2021. For the year as a whole, Maryland employment grew 2.8%. That's about 74,000 jobs. The second column compares the level of employment to the employment level in February of 2020, just before the pandemic began. Between February of 2020 and April of that year, when the pandemic began, the first 2 months of the pandemic, the state lost about 403,000 jobs as things, shut down, businesses closed, et cetera. That was about a 15% drop. Since April of 2020, we've been adding jobs, but as of December, we were still short 47,000 jobs from the level we were pre-pandemic. So we have not gotten them all back. We're one of 26 states that have yet to fully recoup the jobs lost in that couple of months of the beginning of the pandemic. The United States, the U.S. economy as a whole, reached that milestone last August. The next column is the unemployment rate by month for calendar 2022. We started the year at about 5.4%. It drifted down to around 4% over the summer, and then it started to head back up in the fall, but by December it was back down to around 4%. For the year as a whole, the average unemployment rate was 4.4%, and we do rank 10th in the country. We have the 10th highest unemployment rate for the year. The U.S. unemployment rate in 2022 was 3.6%, so we're considerably above that. The next two columns relate to wage growth. Wage data is only available quarterly, so that's why you don't see a number for every month. The data for March is the first quarter, the data on June is the second quarter, and the data for September is the third quarter, and we have not yet received fourth quarter data, so we don't have data for the whole year yet. And what we've done is we've taken total aggregate wages and divided it by the number of workers. And I did that because one of the things that will drive wages up is simply having more people working, and we do have more people working. So to get a sense of the underlying wage growth, we divided it by the number of workers. And you can see it's been running right around a little less than 3%. For the first 3 months of the year, it's up 2.9%. And this isn't actually that different from the experience pre-pandemic. If you go back to the 5 years before the pandemic, this is about the kind of growth rate we were seeing, around a little less than 3%. However, of course, inflation is considerably higher now than it was then. And so the next column adjusts the wage data for inflation using the U.S. Consumer Price Index. And you can see once you do that, this wage per worker adjusted for inflation is actually quite negative. It's down by about 5% in the first 3 quarters of 2022. The table at the bottom is the forecast of inflation. The state contracts with two private forecasting companies, Moody's Analytics and IHS Markit, to provide both U.S. and Maryland economic forecasts. And what I'm showing you here is their forecast of the Consumer Price Index. You can see in calendar 22, the Consumer Price Index was up 8%. They are both forecasting it to come down to about a 4% growth in 2023, and then just a little over 2% in 2024. Of course, the Federal Reserve has been aggressively raising interest rates specifically to get inflation down. If they get down to a CPI of around a little over 2%, that would basically be the Fed's target for the Consumer Price Index. And lastly on this chart is a couple of columns related to the housing market, another big story in calendar 2022. Home sales, and this is data from the Maryland Association of Realtors. So this is home sales, existing home sales, and for the most part does not include new home sales. Existing home sales in Maryland fell 21.2% in calendar 2022. Now, it's important to keep in mind or to note that in 2021, we had record home sales. Home sales, according to the Association of Realtors, was close to 107,000, which is far and away the largest sales in any of their data going back to the late 1990s. So some of this drop is coming off of a record high. But it did bring the level of sales down to about 85,000, which is the lowest level of home sales since 2016. The median home price, though, has been rising. It actually kept rising on a year-over-year basis throughout the whole year until you get to December, when the median home price has flattened out there to just 0.3% growth. Would not be surprising if, as we go into 2023, to see some negative numbers on the median home price. Of course, what's been happening here in the home market has been both a number of factors. One is just there's been very low inventory of homes for sales. There, of course, have been high prices because prices have risen substantially. And then mortgage rates have risen. At the beginning of 2022, mortgage rates on a 30-year fixed mortgage were 3.2%. By the end of the year, they were at 6.4%, had briefly gotten above 7% in the fall. And obviously, this is really hammered affordability in the home market and priced a lot of people out of being able to buy a home. If we go on to the next slide, we'll turn our attention to revenues. And we're going to start by going back to fiscal 2022 to set up kind of why we have so much revenue. So fiscal 2022 ended in June of last year, June 30th. And this chart compares the actual revenues to the estimate, as well as comparing it to fiscal 2021. In total, general fund revenues were over the estimate by $1.6 billion. That was a 7% miss. Ongoing revenues were up about 1.5 billion, and that was about a 6.5% miss. Compared to fiscal 2021, total revenues grew 15.4%, and ongoing revenues grew 17.5%. The vast majority of the overattainment came from the personal income tax. The first line on this chart was over the estimate by a little over $1 billion and grew 15.7%. We collect the income tax in a variety of channels. By far the biggest is withholding from people's paychecks. That grew a little over 7%, but it also was actually very close to the estimate. It was not a major driver of the overattainment. Similarly, we collect quarterly estimated payments from taxpayers, people who have income that is not withheld. They could be self-employed or business investors in a business. It could also be various kinds of investment income, dividends, interest, capital gains, etc. If you don't have it withheld, you pay quarterly estimated payments. That grew substantially, like 19%, but again, it was very close to the estimate and did not really contribute to the overattainment. What did was people filing their tax returns. And in fiscal 22, that was mostly for tax year 2021. It was a little bit for tax year 20, but it was mostly tax year 2021. And payments with those tax returns just exploded. They were up like 58%, and they account for the vast majority of the overattainment. At the same time, refunds, which were up substantially, they were up about 10%, but they were below the estimate by a substantial amount as well. So when we see the income tax being driven by payments with returns, it's usually an indication that what's driving this is really non-wage income, whether it's investment income or business income, and we do know that can be quite volatile. We have every reason to believe capital gains income went up significantly in tax year 21, but we also have every reason to believe it probably went down significantly in tax year 2022 because of what's happened with the stock market. And of course, people will start filing their tax returns for tax year 22 right now. We're entering the tax filing season. Other things that happened in 2022, the corporate income tax exceeded the estimate, grew 16%. We've had very strong growth in the corporate income tax over the last several years, very strong gross receipts growth, but also just extremely low corporate refunds. Corporate refunds in fiscal 2022 were just $140 million, the lowest they've been since fiscal 2007. The sales tax was over the estimate by $268 million. About $65 million of that was due to legislation that was adopted at the 2022 session. This was Chapter 33, which simplified the way that sales tax revenue is distributed to the Blueprint Fund beginning in fiscal 2023. But the bill had an effective date of June 1st, so it impacted the last 2 months of fiscal 2022 and had the effect of completely eliminating the distribution to the Blueprint for those 2 months. The estimate, that $5.7 billion estimate, accounted for the bill, but only accounted for a 1 month effect. So that contributed to the overattainment in the sales tax. Beyond that, the sales tax grew 19.6%. That's a pretty eye-popping growth rate, but it's helpful to keep in mind that we're comparing to fiscal 2021. That's really the first full year of the pandemic. Fiscal 2021 begins in July of 2020, and fully 3/4 of it takes place without the widespread availability of vaccines and all the things that were associated with that first year of the pandemic. Among the other revenue sources, it was a mix of ups and downs. The insurance premium tax was up, the state inheritance taxes were up, and interest on investment, not surprisingly, was significantly above the estimate. But the tobacco tax underperformed. This was the first full year of the most recent tax rate increase, and that was kind of offset. Moving on to the general fund forecast on the next chart. This table compares the Board of Revenue Estimate's most recent estimate from December. They issued a new report in December last month to their previous report in September. There's not much change here, so I'll just mention that in September, the board put out a new estimate in September. That was their first estimate since March. They significantly increased the estimate for fiscal 23 at that point by $1.2 billion. So it was in September that they really caught up with the overattainment from fiscal 2022. So that's already reflected basically in their September estimate. Between September and December, it's more tweaking the forecast based on any changes to the underlying economics as well as the year-to-date collections. Obviously, you can see at the bottom line that was just a $56 million increase in fiscal 2023, and in fiscal 24, there's actually a $167 million decline relative to the December forecast. You can see that For the income tax and the lottery, they were both revised down. The corporate income tax and the sales tax, those are our four big revenue sources, were left alone. In the case of the corporate income tax, although revenues looked like they were doing very well, it came to light in the process of, very late in the process of the board finalizing their estimate, that there were issues with the year-to-date collection numbers that made it hard to know whether the corporate income tax was meeting the September estimate, exceeding it, or was behind it. And so the board chose to leave that estimate alone pending review when they do their next forecast, which will be in early March. The sales tax was also not changed because it really was tracking the September forecast. There was very little change to the board's assumptions about the economy between September and December in terms of employment and wages, but there was a significant downward revision to their assumption about capital gains income. In September, the board used an estimate of capital gains income that was assumed a 14% decline in tax year 2022 and a 9% decline in tax year 2023. When they got to December, they adjusted those estimates. They increased the decline in tax year 22 to 19%, and they increased the decline in tax year 23 to 17%. And this has a major impact on the personal income tax, and that's really what's driving the downward revision to the personal income tax. In total, state and local personal income tax revenues were revised down by $325 million in fiscal 23 and $540 million in fiscal 24. The state collects the income tax for the local governments, as well as collecting the state income tax, and so the board forecasts combined state and local income tax together because that's how the revenue is received. The reason why the general fund does not reflect those kind of downward revisions is because at the same time, in December of every year, the board revisits their estimate of how much of collections are local tax and how much of that are state tax. And they do that using the most recently available tax returns, which now, as of this December, was tax year 2021. And when they went through that exercise, it lowered the estimated local share by enough to partially offset the impact on the general fund. If the local share goes down, then the state share goes up, and so it offset some of the downward revision. This does not mean that the local governments will get less than they're supposed to. They will, when they distribute local income tax revenue, it's always based on the most recent tax year, but the board has to make adjustments and assumptions along the way, and they're simply aligning their own forecasts with the most recently available information from the tax returns. And then the other revisions were fairly minor, obviously, a little bit of a downward revision to the lottery and other revenues, mostly related to year-to-date collections. And that includes what I have to say on the economy and the revenues, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, that completes our whole presentation, so any questions the committee has, we're happy to try to answer.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions by the committee members? We'll start with the vice chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this great information, as always, and really appreciate it. I wanted to go to there was an education, you said there's an education, Maryland Educator Shortage Act. Did you mention that we don't know what that is, but that's something that's potentially being talked about?
There's going to be a bill. The administration's bills have not come in yet. We understand it's for teacher recruitment, to try to improve teacher recruitment in the state, but we don't know the specifics of the strategy.
Do we know how much we spend on state employees' paternity or maternity leave per year? Is that a big?
We could try to calculate that. I've never seen that number, but we could probably try to figure out how many days of leave people, family leave people take.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to have, because I know that right now a lot of our teachers don't have, teachers or educators in the state of Maryland, public educators don't have paid parental leave at the moment. And it'll be good to know whether or not the difference between how much it costs for the state employees versus teachers and educators in our public school system. And how do we calculate that? And is that what, and I wonder if that would have been a part of, a recruitment strategy to want to keep teachers in the teaching profession, instead of having a baby, then leaving. So I know that's not part of it, but I asked that question about the Shortage Act and see what we can do on that.
Okay, we'll take a look and see what information we can get you.
Thank you.
Delegate Ebersol and then Delegate Wilkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So you talked about 13% of the state level jobs not being filled. Does this represent, when they don't fill these jobs, is this a savings somewhere where there's money that's not being paid? Obviously, we're not paying people if they're not in the job. How much? And where is it, I don't know where that money is, because if we fill these positions, we're going to have to pay them. I think it's a great idea, I would say parenthetically. But where's the come and go on the money on that?
Right, so the current year's budget, as Governor Hogan put it together last year, assumed about 8% of state positions would be vacant. So it funded 92% of state positions. So there's this gap between the 8% the budget assumed would be vacant and the 13% that are actually vacant. On a general fund basis, which is where we focus, that's about $144 million of savings in the state agency budgets in the current year. The Moore administration chose to leave that money in those agency budgets, and that is an issue that our department is going to be investigating in the budget analyses of different agencies, trying to find out, what are you doing with that money? Is it overtime because you don't have enough staff, so you're paying more there, or are you reinvesting it in something else? And is the committee comfortable?
And does that become part of your calculation about the amount of money that's left in the budget at the end of the year? In this case, $2.3 billion at the end of fiscal '23, and then '24, $800 million. Does that figure into it if that money's unspent?
It would result, if that money went unspent, the difference between the 8% vacancies and the 13, the agencies would give it back to the general fund. It would lead to an even larger fund balance.
And generally, is that part of your calculation then? Are you doing that right now? Because you say
right now,
that's what it
we're just
stands.
reflecting what the administration has done, and they did not, they assumed, yeah, they left it at the 8%.
Okay.
Like I say, it's possible the appropriations will suggest taking some money out of the 23 budget because we just can't fill all the positions.
If I may. So we talked about jobs. Is this typical to have 8% of the state jobs unfilled, or is this just something Governor Hogan assumed? In other words, we're talking about how many jobs are out there. Is that standard in a year? We often have only 92% of our state positions filled, or is there an average?
I would say historically, if you go further back, we usually would have 5%, 6% of state positions were assumed to be vacant in a year.
Okay.
Over the last 3 or 4 years, especially during the pandemic, but even some before that, the vacancy rates have been extremely high. I mean, as we know, the private sector has been having trouble since the pandemic with hiring as well. So there's been challenges all around. But this is as high as we've ever been, and to our knowledge, at least in the last 40 years in terms of vacancies.
And by the way, great presentation. I didn't say it at the top, and I should have it. It's really, there's a lot for me to ingest, and you guys are doing a great job. But it wouldn't be right to assume that filling these positions would create a huge deficit. Some of that is already set aside, at least that 5% that you're talking about there.
Right, and I should say, Governor Moore, in his budget for this upcoming year, for fiscal '24, assumes, depending on the agency, between 6 and 7% of positions will be vacant. So he's assuming half of the vacancies are going to get filled over the next year.
I hope they do. People need work. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Wilkins?
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I wanted to follow up and ask 1 or 2 questions about the free and reduced lunch program and the increase given the new indicators of how many children we're identifying as in poverty. Can you share more about the indicators? I know we're using Medicaid. You can restate for us the specific indicators. And I also had a follow-up question.
Roughly 185% of the federal poverty level is the maximum that income you can have to qualify for a reduced price meal. And so historically, the state is matched against, for example, the SNAP rolls, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program rolls. And then the school systems have people fill out paperwork, to show whether they're eligible. And those have been the ways the state has largely identified who would qualify for free and reduced price meals. So this was the first time we went the further step of trying to match against our Medicaid rolls. And that's what resulted in such a, as we understand it, is what resulted in this huge jump in the number of kids qualifying for the free and reduced price meals. Because our overall school enrollment goes up a couple of thousand. So it's not that there's more kids, it's that we're identifying more of the kids being low income.
Right. Thank you for the further detail. I also wanted to know, does this impact maintenance of effort in any way in terms of this increase?
Yeah, so under the Kerwin reforms, the local governments may have to pay their share of compensatory education. So it will increase the minimum effort that locals are supposed to put in. Now, some counties were already putting in so much that they're still above that minimum effort, but for some jurisdictions, it will have a impact in pushing up the amount of money they're going to have to come up with.
Okay, thank you. One final quick question. I was very interested in that legislator funds for our legislative initiative. Is that standard or is that new? I don't remember that in recent years.
No, I mean, this is relatively new. I mean, Governor Hogan didn't really do this, but in the past, usually there was a little bit of money left in the capital budget, usually like 15 to 30 million for legislative bond initiatives, and that was the only room that was left for legislative items. Given that the state had a big surplus and this is the first year the General Assembly can actually add itself, the administration tried to leave a little bit of room for the General Assembly.
Well, we certainly appreciate that from the administration. Thank you.
Delegate Feldmark, then Delegate Miller.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. A lot of really good information. I have several questions. I'm going to limit myself, hopefully, to 3 for now. So looking on page 2, when you talk about the acceleration of the minimum wage increase and the corresponding costs of the reimbursement rates for direct service providers, is that, so I'm trying to understand the impact of this. This is kind of a one-time big jump in FY24 relative to where we thought we would be. And then in FY25, a slightly smaller increase, and then eventually sort of leveling out with where our projections would have been. Is that right? Or
Right.
Okay.
So it's an acceleration of the rate increases, but eventually we get to the same place
Right,
we
okay.
would have been.
and that's roughly a 3-year window to get back to where we
Exactly.
thought we would be. Okay. So then on community college funding, on page 6, that bullet, the increase there, which is wonderful, and I'm very happy to see in the budget, is that simply the full funding of the formula,
Correct.
right? So then on page 5, where we have 133 million for higher ed, including community colleges, can you give a little clarification on what that is?
Yeah, so this chart on page 5 there is comparing what was sort of forecasted back in December to what the governor actually did. And so for the public 4 years where there's no formula, the governor has flexibility, he put, I want to say it's about 113 million more than we expected into those institutions, USM,
Okay.
Morgan, St. Mary's College. The community college formulas run off of the aid per FTE at the public 4 years.
Right.
So as a result, the community colleges got an extra of like $18 million or so because the governor put
Okay.
more into the 4 years.
Okay, so it's full funding of the formula, but because we raised the base on the 4-year colleges, it's more than
Yes,
expected.
exactly.
Okay. And then my third question is regarding the unemployment data, and specifically sort of how Maryland ranks compared to other states. I guess two questions. One, an open-ended, do you have insights into that? Like, is it sector-based? Are there other issues sort of for why we're lagging behind compared to other states? And then also for this chart as a whole, I don't expect you to quote it off the top of your head, but do you have data available broken down by county that we could get?
I do have the unemployment rate by county. I can get that to you, sure. As to why we're lagging, I mean, part of it is our overall employment growth is less than the nation as a whole. I mentioned on this chart that we have 2.8% employment growth. Well, the U.S. employment grew 4.1% in 2022. So our employment growth has been lagging the U.S. as a whole all year. And so in that sense, it's not surprising that our unemployment rate is also running ahead of the U.S. I will say that the data is a little squishy because the source of the data for the unemployment rate is different from the source of the data on the employment level. They're both surveys, but they're two different surveys. And the survey that does the unemployment rate doesn't provide a lot of breakdown by like industry or anything like that. So we kind of have the total, but it's important to keep in mind what the unemployment rate is. It's the share of the people who are unemployed and in the labor force divided by the labor force. To be in the labor force, you must either be employed or actively looking for a job. And all the states in the country had a big drop in the labor force when the pandemic began. Some of it was obviously people lost a lot of their jobs. Some people left the labor force for a variety of reasons. Some people have left the labor force and did not come back. Maybe they retired early, or they decided to, there was a fairly sizable number of people who just decided to start their own business, right? So, so all those factor in. It's not simply the employment, it's also what people are choosing to do in terms of whether they're in the labor force or not. And we have seen a significant drop in the labor force that we have also, just like we haven't recovered the jobs, our labor force is considerably lower than it was in 2022. Some of that may be people have left the state. They decided to move. We've had very, very low population growth, and actually Maryland population fell in 2022. I think it was either flat or fell slightly in 2021. So those all contribute. It's kind of that's not really a clear answer, but there isn't really a clear answer. It's exactly what's going on. I will say, and I should have said at the beginning, all of this economic data is subject to revision. And so we will get, revised data as we go through 2023 for 2022. So I don't think the picture will change all that much, but it's possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And I will get you the county unemployment rate.
Delegate Miller.
Hi, yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. My question again has to do with the farm and Medicaid matching as well. I'm kind of new at this, so when you were looking at this, why was it a surprise so much? I was kind of trying to figure that out. If it's being prescribed in Kerwin, and if that was being prescribed, would it have been part of the fiscal note? And then the second part is it an automatic correlation and designation, or is there something that that families have to do, or does it automatically then go into the designation? Thank you.
To the last part, as I understand it, it's pretty much automatic. If they've matched and the child qualified for Medicaid with an income below the 185%, they automatically got counted in the free and reduced price meal count. I think it was a surprise because when the Kerwin folks put the requirement in to match against Medicaid, I don't think there was an expectation it was going to be a huge. I think we thought we'd catch some stragglers. There were a few kids out there who were not already being captured in the free and reduced price meal, and I don't think anyone thought it was going to surge to the degree that we saw it. So I think we as a state, we just didn't realize how many kids we were missing who were eligible.
That is, so from being in education, that is, there's a lot of, especially in the secondary level, of children who don't like to usually apply for that, or their parents, especially out in rural areas where we live. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Delegate Plakovich-Carr. Delegate Miller, can you turn your button off? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the presentation. I had a follow-up question in regards to education funding. So you mentioned the hold harmless funding that 2 districts are qualify for, but I think that was measured as year-over-year total education funding. Is that right? So I'm curious about the last 2 years, we've taken action to provide a different type of hold harmless in regards to enrollment, specifically because many districts had lower enrollment relative to the start of the pandemic. At this point, do we have a sense of how many public school districts in Maryland have lower enrollment relative to prior to the pandemic, and what budget impact that might be having?
I don't have a chart here that gets quite to that. I think overall we have not recovered all of the public school enrollment to the levels that were pre-pandemic. So like statewide, we're still trailing by at least a few thousand where we were. So it has not recovered. We aren't seeing hold harmlesses related to the enrollment declines like we have in previous years, in part because compensatory ed for most jurisdictions grew so much that everybody was getting more money. Almost everybody was getting more money than they did a year ago, even with the enrollment.
Thank you.
There is, I think it's Appendix 17, just for you to peruse at your leisure. It does have a chart that shows by county both the change in enrollment in the schools from last year, as well as the free and reduced price meal change. So you can see how your individual, it is Appendix 17. You can see how your individual counties have fared.
Are there any other questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Committee, we'll see you back here at 1 p.m. for a briefing by our comptroller.
Thanks, Teresa. Thank you.
Who's the delegate who asked about committee?
I
I can't see.
forget getting her name.